Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Keith, and I am your host. As I've mentioned before, we have a few other hosts of this podcast. They are on other days of the week. Still haven't checked which days exactly. But they all do a great job. So, if you like me, you might like them. If you like them, hopefully you'll like me. Today, we're going to be talking about a short story that I read/listened to. Don't know how I feel about audiobooks still. Do I really think that they're great? The only reason I'm mentioning this, I listened to this short story on audiobook. Or novella? Yeah, I would say novella. But regardless, if you've been following the Hyperion discussion that we've been having, I'm listening to that on audiobook as well. And it feels kind of like radio. It's interesting to listen to for sure, but I'm not exactly sure if I'm still gleaning everything from listening to versus reading the book itself. So, I don't know. I think I should do like a side-by-side comparison. Like maybe I'll go grab a short H.G. Wells book and then read it, and then also listen to it on an audiobook and see if I glean anything differently from between the two mediums. I'm sure I will. The reason I mentioned the Hyperion thing, in Hyperion, one of the things that Dan Simmons kind of like rails against or predicts about future civilization is that literacy rates will be incredibly low because you'll be able to watch videos or directly download knowledge or just listen to everything rather than having to manually consume it or hold it in your hands or read it. So I'm not exactly sure how he feels about audiobooks. And again, me as an author also not exactly sure how I feel about audiobooks, but it is what it is. But anyway, the short story that we're talking about this week is called The Color Out of Space, and it's by HP Lovecraft. And many of you will know of Lovecraft's name from Cthulhu, which I have also read portions of and also listened to retellings of. Haven't listened to the audiobook of it yet. Who knows, maybe I'll do that in the near future. Not totally sure. But this particular novella, what have you, is available on Audible for $3. It's only an hour-long listen, so you're basically just paying $3 for like a quasi-movie you can watch over and over again. Or play for your friends. This is definitely I don't know, it's different than a movie, like watching a movie with your friends. But I would totally play this if I was throwing an old-timey party, like a themed party. I would totally play this. It's really scary. The style of H.P. Lovecraft has always been kind of campy to me, but I think that's because so many other people tried to emulate it because it was legitimately very terrifying. Science fiction horror. In fact, honestly, one of the best science fiction horror movies I've ever seen, Annihilation, I'm 90% sure that it's based pretty heavily off of this book, and you'll find out why. I'll probably have a whole segment towards the end of this podcast. by probably I mean most likely, about the similarities between the two and how Annihilation does a good job of like taking the elements of this story and putting them into a movie. It's just pretty good. It's really interesting and unique, but all that to say, Lovecraft's style choices for writing are interesting because he starts out like in a very mundane fashion where it's kind of just like, oh, this old country folk was telling this story. And it's funny, like almost all of his stories start out the same way where it's like, oh, I heard a story from a person who heard a story from another person. Like there's something very human about the way that he frames the storytelling aspect of his narratives. So in this particular book, the story is being told by like a researcher or a historian or like somebody whose role hasn't been told to be very specific, but it may even be an author. I think frequently Lovecraft likes to say like, oh, this was an author who wanted to write a book about this thing, and so he went and got direct source interviews from people, and like that kind of like playing on this idea of like a tribalistic oral tradition of storytelling, even though it's like we're reading it in a book, so it's obviously not oral storytelling. Oral as in like Aural. I think that's how you spell it. I mean, you could also say Oral because it is like someone sitting in front of you and telling you the story. But he's kind of taking and like almost combining the medium of written word with oral storytelling by telling us that the thing that we're reading is something that was said out loud by another human being. So in some regard, like the way that he frames voice in this short story as well as other short stories that he has written, like Cthulhu is pretty much written in the same exact way. The way that he does that incites a specific type of like, I don't know, imaginative space, I think. Because if it was just like, oh, here's the first person narration of this thing that's happening, then it's like, okay, that's scary, but it's harder to empathize because now we are like, it's like exact. You know, the experience is exact. Whereas when we are kind of given like a little bit more distance by saying like, this is the story of a person being told to another person, like it's very meta. And I don't know if Lovecraft did it intentionally or tried to do this intentionally. It was probably something that he just did. And then people were like, hey, that really works. And he said, okay, I'll continue to do it. But because of the way that he handles that material, the way that he portrays the story as being told by a person telling a story, we are able to get distance enough from the things that are happening to where now there's something that's more easily empathized with, or I guess, not necessarily just empathize with, but more easily conceptualized by us as individuals. So like when the wording is used and it's vague, we have the space to imagine something terrifying and life-sucking, something outside of what we would normally be able to comprehend, because we're not tied to the fact that a human being is explaining the direct experience to us. It's a human telling a human what another human told them. So the distance that we get from the thing in itself is part of what creates like the suspense, because it's like, well, this person experienced this firsthand and I'm this terrified of it being 3 degrees removed. So you empathize with the person who's experiencing it more, and you have the imaginative space to kind of like create your own vision or version of what it is that's being told to you. And like, if I'm being honest, this particular story was so terrifying to me that I legitimately thought like I might not be able to be in my house alone for too long tonight if I'm not careful, because if I don't control the thoughts that are coming from this, like this scary story, I could easily go down a very like weird path. And once I kind of describe like what the story is about, which we're gonna get to in just a moment, I promise, I just wanted to kind of praise Lovecraft. And, you know, like if you're interested in reading more of his works, I think it's important to take notice of things like this, because a lot of authors, they have their kitschy little thing that they'll do. And it seems like Lovecraft's is, ooh, it came from outer space. But like, even though he does that, and that's the simple answer to what the thing that we're scared of, that doesn't change the fact that it's still horrifying, because he paints it he makes it out in such a way that, like, we can envision the thing that he's describing to us, because his diction and syntax are excellent, right? And metaphor, analogy, everything, and like all of his symbolic language and like description of setting and things like that, all those things are impeccable. So like the thing that we're imagining that is the terror is very well described, but what isn't as well described is the feeling of the person observing it. And so you kind of adopt this like viewpoint of the person who's observing it. And I think that, like, if you're going to go into his books hoping for something like, you know, unique or interesting, that is kind of the big, unique, interesting thing, is that he's able to create these incredibly far-fetched and outlandish scenarios that you as an individual can put yourself in the place of the person who is experiencing it in the first place, right? So again, I just wanted to mention that at the top, because I think if you read this, you'll probably want to read other Lovecrafts, and the other Lovecrafts are very similar. And so if you kind of take that approach to it, knowing his like gimmick, I personally think that it makes it that much better when you see it go off without a hitch, which it does in most of his novels and novellas and short stories. So the basic premise of the story is that this researcher has traveled to this town where they're going to be putting in a reservoir. At the bottom of this reservoir is an old abandoned farm that was owned by the gardeners. And at that farm there is a well, and the entire like town, surrounding towns, talk about these weird things that happened at the gardeners, that's who owns the property, the gardener's farm, following a specific event during which a meteorite fell onto their property. So a meteorite falls onto their property, and then a bunch of scientists come out, grab it, and extract this like odd globule which has this coloration to it that nobody is familiar with. They put it in a glass vial and it goes invisible. It's oddly attracted to like things that are made of silicone, as in the way that it behaves in the laboratory. The researchers said it was really odd, and they end up smashing it with a hammer, which don't know. There's really no like kind of talk about what happens after that or what happens to the scientists themselves. And so the gentleman who has, I think he's part of the reservoir committee or something like that, goes to the town to figure out what's up with the gardener's old farm. Is there anybody still living there? What's the story behind it? And he comes into contact with a gentleman who was best friends with the previous owner of the farm, and that gentleman is the one who tells the story to the main character. That's what we kind of basically are following throughout the novel. So, yeah, I don't know the best way to go about like describing it, because I could give like, if I give you the premise, then it kind of gives away the whole thing. So I kind of want to treat this as like we're walking through it kind of blind. You know, if you watched Annihilation, I'm sure that you're already hearing a parallel here where like a meteorite crashes onto some random spot, and now weird stuff is happening around that random spot. So that is where the similarities start, and they certainly don't end there either. So we are going to take a quick commercial break now, and then after that we'll get started on talking about like the names of characters as well as what it is that starts happening on the farm after the meteorite crashes there. So we will be right back.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Ready to before the break. I just talked a bunch about why HP Lovecraft's such a cool author and like how his gimmicky type of storytelling is like specifically really cool. So, yeah. Now we're gonna get into the specifics of this book, which apparently I think is also a movie that's been done, let's see, 5 times someone has turned this into a movie. This was published back in 1927. It's based in the 1600s. And, yeah, it's been made into a movie 5 times. Die Monster Die in 1965, The Curse in 1987, Color from the Dark, 2008. The Color Out of Space, Die Farb, or it's probably Latin, Dia Farbe, I don't know, in 2010. And Color Out of Space in 2019, which has Nicolas Cage in it. So we might watch it next week. Who knows? It was originally published in the 1927 edition of Hugo Gernsback's science fiction magazine, Amazing Stories, which makes sense. And if you remember, I have mentioned Amazing Stories in podcasts before this when we talked about science fiction in general. I guess this is probably one of his most popular works, and it's a personal favorite of his. Interesting. Yeah. So... I was correct in the assumption. I'm kind of reading off of a more precise summary now rather than just going off of what I heard. It is an individual who was a surveyor, and they're coming from Boston, telling a story that is being told by Amy. So Amy is supposedly this crazy man who was very good friends with the Gardner family, and the Gardner family is the one who owns the farm where the well that has where the meteorite fell, and that area is now when he is sorry, it says 1882 in the synopsis, but I'm pretty sure it's at the 1600s was when the meteorite fell onto the farm, but not totally sure there, I guess, but. So apparently this is in 1882 that this story is based, not the 1600s. So I misspoke earlier. So the unnamed surveyor is talking to Amy, and Amy knew the Gardner family, and he's telling the story of what happened to the Gardner family at their farm, which is now referred to as the Blasted Heath. The Blasted Heath. That's funny. There's a card game that I play, and they use the word Heath several times. I'm pretty sure they say Blasted Heath once or twice, which is interesting. So Ami is perceived to be crazy by the townspeople, by everybody else who lives around him. But after the telling of the story, I don't particularly think of him as being crazy. I just think of him as being, I guess, tainted would be the right word. Not totally sure there. So... a meteorite falls onto the Gardner's lands in 1982, and a bunch of scientists show up, and they want to figure out where it's from. And the meteorite kind of like changes in size, and there's a bunch of scientists there. They can't figure out what's going on with it. And as it's changing in size, it leaves behind like drops that they call, like the story refers specifically to as globules of color. And which is like the only way that they have to describe them. And kind of like Philip K. Dick. Is it Philip K. Dick? Yeah, I think it's Philip K. Dick. So kind of like Philip Dick in the way that, or in the sense that he often will say the title of his book somewhere in like a pivotal point in the story. Like Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is absolutely a line in the book. I can't remember where, but it's when I can't remember the guy's name now. Deckard is kind of like wondering what happens to my like little pets when they start to go to sleep, my biological animal, or my android animal replicants. Like when they sleep, do they dream of like robotic stuff? So HP Lovecraft has a tendency to do the same thing, where he specifically uses the phrase "a color out of space," and it's not like from outer space. It's like a color out of space, as in like people can't really perceive it as being a color. It just kind of has this like glow. He specifically says doesn't fall within like a spectrum of what would be considered to be normal or visible. So there's just a bunch of weird stuff that happens surrounding this meteorite. So it is eventually destroyed by lightning bolts. And like I mentioned earlier, when the like globules of color are put into a glass beaker, they disappear. It seems that they're like absorbed by silicone, which is, glass. Glass is made of silicone, I think. Or it has silica in it, because sand. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that that's correct, which is why he mentions that specifically. So after the meteorite falls, weird things start happening on the gardener's farm. So his crops get really, like, he has a substantial harvest, and everything is like bloated and just kind of weird, but all of it is inedible. So like all of his crops that grow, he has tons and tons of like beautiful flowers that kind of look like, they look like augmented versions of what they were originally, but what grows on them, while it is larger and more plentiful, is completely inedible. And what starts to happen is that it spreads into other things. So it's kind of like radiation would be the best way to describe this phenomena. So at first the gardeners think that the ground has been, ruined by the meteorite, because once the plants start to go, once his crops start to go, then all of the other plants in the area start to go as well. And this is the part where things start to get a little suspicious, because then the first person on the farm starts to lose her mind, and that is John Gardner's wife, Nahum, I believe. Or, no, sorry, Nahum is the main character. I don't know I can't remember what Nahum's wife's name is, but regardless, Mrs. Gardner, that's what we'll call her, Mrs. Gardner goes mad, and he puts her in the attic, which the casual way in which H.P. Lovecraft is like, this woman went mad, so he just locked her in the attic. Like, I don't know, it's very much like, it doesn't sound like the voice of an educated person telling a story. It sounds like the voice of like a layman who is telling the story in a more concise way than like someone from the hills would say it. And like the surveyor, who's the narrator for us, specifically makes mention of the fact that he's kind of like changing the way that things have been said or stated so that we can kind of understand a little bit better of what was actually going on. So the first thing that happens after this meteorite crashes is that Gardner's wife, his crop goes bad, and then the plants in an area around it start to go bad, and they start to turn this like grayish color would be the best way to describe it, where almost as if the life is being sucked out of them. And then Gardner's wife just starts to go crazy. She starts, like, this is where the novel got really scary for me, because it just casually says, like, well, at first she kind of, like, would have these random little fits, and then she started being, like, epileptic, and then she started being not able to walk, and then she started crawling around on all fours, screaming. And then she just sort of, like, basically went, like, I'm getting goosebumps just talking about it, because the way that it so casually describes this, like, woman falling into complete and utter insanity and inability, like, ineffectualness is terrifying. And again, just to emphasize what I talked about at the top of the podcast, the reason that, like, HP Lovecraft is so good at writing these types of stories is because he can just, like, casually put you into this space of imagining this horrific thing, and it's like, okay, now what? This is scary. More than scary. So after Mrs. Gardner goes crazy, then the vegetation itself starts to kind of, like, erode into, like, a gray powder would be the best way to describe it. And apparently the well from the water starts to taste funny. In addition to that, other members of the Gardner family start to go a little bit crazy. So the next person to go crazy is one of Gardner's sons named Thaddeus. So Gardner also locks him in the attic, which is, again, it's just so funny that they're, like, just casually locking people in the attic. Gardner has started to, like, isolate himself from the other farmers in the area because he's not totally sure what's going on. And so, he doesn't he doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't want to spread it to anybody. So I guess he's being responsible, I guess. So the guy who's telling the story to the surveyor, his name is Ami or Pierce, but he's referred to as Ami throughout the novel. He's the only person who maintains contact with the Gardner family after all of this stuff starts to happen. So he's the only reason that anyone knows that, like, Gardner locked his wife in the attic, locked his son in the attic. And so Pierce / Ami, whatever we were going to call him, decides that he's going to go visit the Gardner family because he hasn't heard from them in 2 weeks. And when he gets there, he's a little suspicious because the chimney doesn't have any smoke rising from it, which is definitely odd. And then he's worried that Gardner's dead. The primary guard, Mr. Gardner. And so he goes into Nahum Gardner. He goes into the house, and Nahum is on the couch, and he is kind of like he's still got a semblance of sanity, but he just starts muttering about how his son Merwin has vanished while retrieving water from the well, and he says that the well took him. He says that the well has this power or this presence to, like, draw people in, and you know that it's dangerous, but you can't resist it. Like, something about it just, like, sucks you into it. And the other son, Thaddeus, dies is dead in the attic. But the wife is not. So when Thaddeus dies, Nahum buries him, which there's other things in this story that come up later on that make that fact a little bit more terrifying. Thaddeus dies before Pierce goes to visit the Gardner family. And so when Pierce gets there, the only person who's left, aside from Nahum, is the wife, who has been locked in the attic the entire time. And, of course, Pierce has to go up and check on her because Nahum says that he hasn't left the couch for days. So I'm getting goosebumps just talking about this. Pierce goes up to the attic and opens the door, and I'm going to tell you what happens right after this quick commercial break. I hope that you're, like, on the edge of your seats right now. I seriously doubt it because I'm not doing nearly as good of a job telling this story as HP Lovecraft does, but, listen to it. Anyway, we'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
I was going to tell you what happened to Mrs. Gardner and what Pierce sees when he goes up into the attic to find her. She's totally fine. Everything's cool. No, that is absolutely not what happens. So he goes up into the attic and he describes this like horrible stench, and then walks into her room and says that he just sees a like shriveled black figure in the corner, and it looks kind of like out of this world dead body, but it looks up at him. So it's like he basically describes it as if like it was having the life sucked out of it, like slowly, and but like still being tortured by life. So he kills her because the state of living in which she is now currently in is like, it's not even really living at all. So he puts, he even calls it it. He puts it out of its misery, because it's not really, it's not really her. It's not really human any longer. It's just kind of like a husk of a thing that had consciousness at some point. And so after this, we get a little like kind of description of what is happening to the other livestock or the other creatures on the farm aside from just the human inhabitants. So the horses and the dogs and the cats have all like run away because they're somewhat intelligent, but the cows and like sheep and other things are not as intelligent. So they have stuck around, and they're not as easily able to escape. So they, Pierce describes them as having, like little bits and pieces of their body, like start to look at like Nahum's wife did. So they have this like diseased and festering, not like a wound, but just like this portion of their skin where the life has been like sucked out of it. And there's like random like bulbous kind of like graying outgrowths where like parts of their body are like ashing off or disintegrating. So, it's pretty creepy. Yeah. And so basically what Pierce is able to conclude is that same affliction has been happening to the human residents as well. So while he's in the attic, his horse itself runs away, and he hears a splash of water. And so it seems to him like something is in the well. And like even in just describing this, like the terrifying thing and the great thing about like all of this is that even in just me describing this story to you, like I'm having a hard time not getting creeped out. That's kind of how in your head Lovecraft gets. And the way that he does that, again, it just by accessing this weirdly primal sense of horror that I can't compliment him enough for doing this so well. I don't easily get scared, and so like even just talking about this, I'm like getting goosebumps on my back. It's a really good story. You should definitely read it. So while he's in the attic, he hears the splash of water, and the horse runs away. And then he goes downstairs thinking like, oh, my horse must have knocked a brick into the well. And Nahum is now like, Pierce is in the kitchen, and all of a sudden Nahum grabs the hem of his shirt, and Pierce turns around, and Nahum went from looking like himself to looking like almost like his wife. Like he started having like all of the sores and things, and like random patches of like graying skin and disintegrating skin that the wife had within a span of like moments. And so it's just really freaking creepy. So Nahum dies, and this is when he tells Pierce all of the stuff that happened of like his son's dying in the attic, his one son running away, the other son disappearing into the well. And so it's like really creepy. So naturally Pierce, or Ami, goes off to grab the authorities because there's a bunch of dead people now, and he has to like go explain how these people died and that he wasn't involved. So he goes to the police station and says like, you guys need to like come check this out, blah blah blah. And so they insist that he goes with them, and he returns with 6 men, and one of them is a doctor who examines Nahum's remains and says like, I don't know what the heck could do this. And Pierce kind of like has noticed that every time he sees that like color, that the things around it start to like die or kind of like fade away or turn that they once he sees that out of space color, now he sees things around it dying. And so he he saw it in Nahum's face as well as in the addict. So it's kind of like you get infected by this out of space color, I guess would be the right way to phrase it. And so while they're there, they try to search for the remains of the other 2 sons. And in doing so, they decide to pull up all of the water from the well. And when they pull up all the water from the well, they find Merwin and Zenos, the 2 younger of the 3 sons, skeletons at the bottom of the well, as well as the bones of a bunch of other creatures. And they're still there as the sun is starting to set, and they send a guy down into the well to try to figure out how deep it goes. And he puts a stick into the bottom of it to like measure the depth, and he says that his stick isn't long enough to get down to the bottom of the well. So there's this like really just like terrifying feeling of like infinity within this thing that consumes. Like it just it's endless. So they pull this guy out of the well, and then the sun starts to set, and so they all go inside, and the well starts to glow. And there's been stories going around the town that like everything on the Gardner farm glows at night. So like the livestock start to glow, even Nahum has started to glow, and the well especially glows. So when the well glows and all 6 of these guys see it, they're naturally very freaked out, and they decide, or one of them tries to run outside to save the horses, but Pierce tells him, don't go out there. Whatever this thing is it like consumes living things, but not in like a natural way. And then literally like a couple minutes after that, they hear Pierce's horse emit this sound that no horse they've ever heard before or have heard since can emit. And so naturally it dies. And all of the animals are freaking out, including all of the men inside the home. and they start to notice that like there's a gas that is associated with this glowing color that's outside of what would normally be like a regular within the visual spectrum, but they can like kind of see its presence or its aura, if you will. And so the gas starts to come into the house. They start seeing this kind of like presence in the house, if you will. So they all decide to leave out the back, naturally. And as they get to the top of the ridgeline, there's like a big flash of light and that flies up into the sky, and all of it kind of like supposedly vanishes, but none of them want to look at it. They're just kind of like listening to it happen behind them. Well, Pierce turns around and he sees a little bit of this like this color, this gas like rising up into the sky, not leave completely. So as he's telling the story, he's basically saying like, look, that thing is still down there. So the person, the surveyor who is telling us the story of what Pierce saw, says, you know, I'll never drink the water from Arkham, which I wouldn't be surprised if that's where the name for the Batman Arkham Asylum came from, at all. It sounds like something that people would want to reference as a Lovecraft story. People love referencing Lovecraft. Lovecraft. Also funny that he has such a nice last name and writes such like terrible stories that are like little mind worms that get in your head and freak you out for days. But Pierce, Ami, same person, been kind of referring to them both ways, or him both ways, is like still terrified of this thing being there and hasn't been able to be the same since, because there's talk around the town that the blight that little that comes from the well is spreading, like they say, an inch a year. Hunters can't go towards that area because their dogs will not be able to follow scents. People don't want to buy the land. Nobody else wants to try to farm there. It's just generally like avoided. And when they go back the next day after that blight has like occurred, they only really find like the carcass of Pierce's dead horse and a bunch of like just tons and tons of gray dust and like a chimney. Like even the house, all the wood of the house was turned to dust. So like just like stone basically remains. When it snows there, supposedly the snow is thinner because the ground is hotter, supposedly. All of the gardener's neighbors leave their homes and flee the area, and nobody will live anywhere near that area except for like people who are in dire straits or in dire need of like land or space to live. So that's kind of the conclusion, is that, you know, they're going to flood this valley to turn it into a reservoir, and the author, the narrator, says he hopes that the water is always deep there because there's some sort of like very specific horror that lives at the bottom, or that will be now living at the bottom of this reservoir lake. So yeah, that's terrifying in its own right. So I'm sure as you've been listening to this, you're thinking, okay, so like what, why are you talking about this? Aside from the fact that it's a really good, scary story. I just really felt like a lot of what Lovecraft was doing in the story was very effective writing. And I do think that there is like a specific existential dread that Lovecraft has a tendency to tap into with certain things, where he is just like good at portraying the unknown in a way that becomes tangible, and in that tangibility it becomes terrifying. So I kind of wanted to just talk about like what it is that Lovecraft does well in his storytelling, why this is like such a great example of science fiction horror, and like all of the things that I'm pretty sure this story has had like influence on, at least in some capacity. Like I don't know necessarily directly, but like obviously a lot of pop culture or a lot of pulp science fiction has been influenced by Lovecraft. I think this story specifically has a pretty wide reach. So we'll talk about that and some other things right after this last commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Up our discussion, thanks for sticking around, on A Color Out of Space, which is the short story. I called it a novella earlier. If it appeared in a magazine, it's definitely just a short story. It was just an hour and a half long on the audiobook, so though it didn't have to be necessarily, I think they could have easily gotten through a little bit faster. Regardless, the first 20 minutes of the book were just this weird sort of lulling you into this oh, this is just a country bumpkin folk tale. You shouldn't think too much of this. The blah, 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 blah. Yeah, it was not that. Decidedly not that. So, yeah, I wanted to just kind of talk a little bit more about how the movie Annihilation, I think, is based pretty heavily off of this short story. So, if you guys remember, I've talked about Annihilation a bunch of times on this podcast. I compared it to Arrival, because they were both kind of highbrow science fiction. Arrival was a little bit blockbustery, but Annihilation was definitely kind of an art house science fiction film. Arrival had some elements of art housiness to it. I would generally describe it also as being kind of an art house film, even though it's definitely not as art housey as Annihilation. But it's still, it has those elements to it of unique cinematography, interesting and compelling storytelling, unique symbolism, things like that. And Annihilation has all of those things in abundance as well. Well, in Annihilation, if we remember correctly, there is an anomaly. I can't remember what it's called now. It's been a little while since I've seen the movie, and even though I've seen it 3 times, I cannot remember what they call it. But there's a meteorite that crash lands at a lighthouse, and weird things start happening around the lighthouse, where instead of life being sucked out of things, the biological makeup of things in the area, of living things in the area, is dramatically altered. So, for instance, when they go into the area that has been altered by the thing in the meteorite in the lighthouse, the Shimmer, that's what it's called. So they go into the Shimmer, if you remember the story at all. So they go into the Shimmer, Natalie Portman, who plays the lead, and it goes into the Shimmer, and when the first thing they encounter is this alligator, or are these plants that have the stem is one species, and then there's 8 to 12 different species of flowers that are growing off of one vine. And so there's this weird, just prismatic effect going on with the way that genetics work when they're inside the Shimmer. And a shimmer is a phenomena caused by a refraction of light. In the same way that the thing in Lovecraft's novel is caused by a shimmer, for lack of another word, but basically a refraction of light in a way that exists outside of the normal visual spectrum. And I don't know if you've seen the end of the movie, but at the end of the movie, when you look into Natalie Portman's eyes as well as Oscar Isaac's character's eyes, there is a shimmer. And when they run into the thing in the lighthouse, it is a giant shimmer that came from a meteorite. The same way that this out-of-space color comes from a thing inside of a meteorite. So there's a parallel there. In addition, the townfolk say that this area of death spreads an inch every year. The shimmer spreads a small amount every year as well. It in the film, if you have seen it, and if you haven't seen it, I'll just tell you. Obviously, I don't know why I have to say if you've seen it. Weird qualifier. The shimmer has already consumed like a couple small towns, and so when they get to like certain parts of the shimmer, they start seeing the remains of the people who didn't leave when the shimmer started to consume the town, or who didn't leave before the shimmer started to consume it, so they didn't know what was going to happen to them, and they've been turned into like, it looks like dryads, but they're not like humans. It's just like a bunch of vines and flowers in the shape of humans, which is scary in its own right. More trippy than anything else. The film is definitely like scary in the sense that it's like a thriller and it's got science fiction horror in it, and there's some really awful things that happen in there, but also really trippy just in like this is really freaky type of sense. So yeah, if you are faint of heart, definitely don't watch it at night by yourself. Watch with a friend, and make sure that that friend is staying the night. Because it definitely gets a little scary if you're not used to it. So, yeah. Those are the similarities there. And this is something that I think that like science fiction does really well, and something that the horror genre generally does pretty commonly, is this idea of infection. This idea of like an unseen pathogen that is either enlightens or sucks the life out of, or causes an illness of specific kind. And I think that like the symbolism behind that particular trope is like profoundly terrifying, because I think it represents a lot of different things. I mentioned the idea a long time ago that the face huggers and the chest bursters, the aliens, the xenomorph series, that like part of the symbolism of the alien coming out from a human and using a human body to reproduce, part of the symbolism of that is this idea of the evil innate in humankind, and in like that in some capacity within a human being lurks this perfect predator that can, under the right circumstances, come forth and like destroy humanity. I think that idea maybe isn't like the universal way to which things that emerge, or that disease is kind of used in novels and things like that. I don't think it's universal, but I do think that there is some clout to the idea that like in almost every instance, the scariest things that kill us are the things that come from within, or the things that are unseen, or the things that are beyond understanding. The shimmer, for example, goes into you and transforms you internally, and then eventually destroys your way of being. It doesn't kill you necessarily, but it does destroy your way of being. So rather than you continuing to be a human being, your way of being now becomes that of a plant, or that of whatever it is that the shimmer prismatically transforms you into. So, one of the team members in Annihilation gives herself to the shimmer, and we don't know what happens to her, but it, could be heavily inferred that she gets turned into one of those plant statue-looking people. So it's not that she's died. It's that what she was is now something else. So, in a sense, the horror doesn't come from the pain of death. It comes from the transformation of your current way of being. And in some way, I think that that's like probably a commentary on religion. I don't know that the people who wrote the story were thinking like, oh, this represents a change in the status of being, a change in your way of being. So we're commenting on religion because religion is supposed to, ideally, a lot of religions say, God comes into your life and changes your way of being, because now you have this knowledge of a thing beyond yourself, so you can no longer act in the ways of the world, quote unquote. And so that's part of what is transformative about religious experience, is that it kind of has that same type of, I don't want to say like invasive, but you kind of invite that thing into you to transform you from within. It just in a way that isn't horrific. And when it's unwelcomed, then it's very similar to disease. And we have built within our evolution an innate fear of like disease and of people who are diseased. There's a reason that like people with skin diseases especially, or like deformities, there's a reason that we avoid them. It's because some part of our brain instinctually has been evolutionarily refined to get us to a point where those things become repulsive, because our natural thought is, what if I end up looking like that, or I end up being sick like that? And so we are naturally deterred from these things that our brain tells us are like disgusting or contagious. There's entire sects of philosophy that basically say that the idea of consciousness and sentience comes from the ability to be disgusted by something. And so by combining this sense of disgust and disease with this like spiritual, otherworldly thing that is intangible and can like move in and out of spaces without seeming to have a concrete body, it makes it even more terrifying it makes the whole thing more terrifying. Because what's scary about the color out of space isn't that a bunch of people die in a weird way. What's scary about it is that the thing that kills them is this like imperceivable thing that can like splash in the water, but also like can just like suck the life out of things by just being in proximity with it. And I think that's also like what some of the abject terror that comes from the Annihilation film, I think that's also a part of that as well, because it's not that the shimmer itself, the thing at the center of the shimmer, is going to find you and kill you. It's that it can, but it chooses not to, and it does other small, sinister, pernicious things to get to you. So it's almost like this like nagging thing in the back of your head of like the unknown. And that's what I think HP Lovecraft is so good at doing, is taking these like small little feelings that you have where it's like, oh, I got a little tingle down my neck. I wonder what that could have possibly been. Oh, I feel like there's a weird thing in the, like this well is this weird thing, like this deep hole that I draw water out from that I drink. Like that sounds kind of scary because I don't know what's at the bottom of it. And he takes these like weird little suspicions that we have about the world around us and these small little unknown things that we can never know 100% about and never be 100% sure of, takes them and then transforms them into these grandiose eldritch horrors from other planets. So, you know, a meteor falls and there's like this one little element of it that people are like, hey, that's kind of weird. And now that little thing is everywhere. And he does the same thing with like when he tells Cthulhu, it's like, oh, this thing, I saw this thing, this little sign, and now this sign is everywhere. So it kind of like plays into multiple like evolutionary inclinations that we have about the way that we perceive the world, specifically with like confirmation bias, where it's like, am I really paranoid, or are they after me? And just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean that they're not after me. And that's kind of like this state that you get put into of like, is it there? Is it not there? Is this guy crazy? Is he not crazy? Should I drink the water? Should I not drink the water? Because in this story, at the end of it, the guy who's surveying for the reservoir says like, if I come back here, I'm not drinking the water. Like, I don't care how deep that reservoir is. From what Ami said, it doesn't matter how deep the reservoir is. The thing will taint the water and drive everybody in this town mad and eventually like consume it. And that's like it's this unknown little thing, this little nagging thing in the back of your head that eventually just kind of consumes your thoughts, and that's what fear is. So the thing that Lovecraft does that other authors aren't good at doing is giving fear anthropomorphic characteristics, or like tangible characteristics that we can now imagine. So it's almost like the pure sense of what fear is now embodied in this thing that we've subjected ourselves to reading about. So anyway, all that to say, great book, great little short story. Definitely check it out. I'm going to watch the movie. I don't know if I'll talk about it, but I'm going to watch the movie. At least one of the 5 adaptations of it, though I think Annihilation is an adaptation of it in some capacities, just with a slightly different premise. Some slightly different result from the same premise. So, yeah, that's all I've got for you guys today. Thanks for listening. If you like the podcast, leave us a good review. Follow us on Twitter, social media, Facebook, all that good stuff. Stay safe out there. And, yeah, that's all I've got. Have a good day, everybody.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.